Society had written him off as mentally ill, worthless, a burden on taxpayers. But when the unthinkable happened and the city fell apart above ground, everyone learned why this homeless veteran had been disappearing into storm drains and abandoned subway tunnels. He wasn't hiding from civilization. He was preparing to save it. Welcome to Retired Soldier Stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale of hidden preparation and underground heroism, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe that society's forgotten can become its greatest protectors, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who serve in ways we never see. His name was Peter Rodriguez, though the city knew him as Tunnel Pete, if they bothered to know him at all. For 5 years, he'd been a fixture on the streets of downtown Portland, pushing a shopping cart filled with what most people assumed was garbage, sleeping under bridges and disappearing into storm drains and maintenance tunnels that honeycomb beneath every major city. The commuters who hurried past him each morning saw exactly what society trained them to see. Another homeless veteran who couldn't adjust to civilian life. Probably suffering from PTSD. Definitely suffering from poor hygiene and poorer life choices. They dropped spare change into his coffee cup when guilt moved them, called police when his presence made them uncomfortable, and generally wished he would simply disappear. What they didn't see, what nobody saw, was where Peter went when he vanished underground each day. They didn't see the systematic way he'd mapped every tunnel, every access point, every abandoned space beneath their feet. They didn't see the supplies he'd been carefully stockpiling, the infrastructure he'd been quietly building, or the detailed plans he'd been developing for a scenario he hoped would never come, but knew inevitably would, because Master Sergeant Peter Rodriguez, United States Army Corps of Engineers, hadn't spent 30 years building bridges, fortifications, and survival systems in the world's most hostile environments, just to forget everything when he came home. He'd simply learned to apply those skills in a theater of operations that society refused to acknowledge existed. Peter's transformation from decorated engineer to invisible street dweller hadn't happened overnight. Like many veterans, his return to civilian life had been a gradual descent through a system that promised support, but delivered bureaucracy that honored service in speeches but abandoned servants in practice. He'd come home from Afghanistan in 2019, after 3 decades of military service that had taken him to every war zone America had entered since the 1990s. Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and dozens of smaller conflicts that never made the evening news. His specialty was rapid infrastructure development, building bridges under fire, establishing water purification systems in hostile territory, creating defensive positions that could withstand anything an enemy could throw at them. His record was spotless: 127 successful operations, 43 combat commendations, and the kind of practical engineering knowledge that came from building things that had to work the first time because there wouldn't be a second chance. He'd saved more lives through infrastructure than most soldiers saved through combat, and he'd done it while being shot at by people who considered American engineers legitimate military targets. But 30 years of war had left marks that weren't visible on his service record. The nightmares that made sleep impossible. The hypervigilance that turned every crowd into a potential threat. The inability to relax in spaces where he couldn't see all the exits. The VA had diagnosed him with severe PTSD, prescribed medications that made him feel like a stranger in his own mind, and eventually declared him 100% disabled when it became clear that traditional treatment wasn't working. Peter's disability payments were enough to keep him housed and fed, but they weren't enough to make him feel useful. For 30 years, his value had been measured by his ability to solve problems that nobody else could solve, to build things that nobody else could build. Civilian life offered him nothing but the slow suffocation of irrelevance. The breaking point came in 2020 during the height of the pandemic lockdowns. Peter was living in a small apartment, spending his days watching the news and growing increasingly convinced that society was more fragile than people realized. The supply chain disruptions, The infrastructure failures, the way essential services collapsed when stressed beyond their designed capacity. It all reinforced lessons he'd learned in war zones about the thin line between civilization and chaos. That's when Peter made a decision that his therapist would have called delusional, but that his military experience told him was tactical. If society was going to collapse, he was going to be ready to help rebuild it. He started small, exploring the utility tunnels and storm drains that most people never knew existed. Portland, like most major cities, was built on top of an older city, with layers of infrastructure dating back decades. Abandoned subway tunnels from transportation projects that were never completed. Steam tunnels from a heating system that had been replaced. Storm drains large enough to drive trucks through. Maintenance access to power, water, and communication systems that kept the city running. Peter began mapping these spaces with the same systematic precision he'd once used to survey hostile territory. He documented every access point, every intersection, every potential choke point or defensive position. He tested the structural integrity of tunnels that hadn't been inspected in decades. He identified sources of fresh water, areas suitable for food storage, spaces that could be converted into living quarters. Within 6 months, Peter had created the most comprehensive map of Portland's underground infrastructure that had ever existed, but mapping was just the first phase of his operation. The second phase was preparation. Peter liquidated everything he owned above ground, his apartment, his furniture, his car, everything except the most essential personal items. He used the money to purchase supplies, but not the kind of supplies that would draw attention. A few cases of military MRAs here, some water purification tablets there, medical supplies from Army surplus stores, tools from construction supply companies, communication equipment from electronics retailers. He never bought enough of anything in one place to seem suspicious, and he always paid cash. To the outside world, he appeared to be just another homeless veteran buying the kind of gear that homeless people needed to survive. Nobody questioned why a man living on the streets might want a water filtration system or emergency medical supplies. But Peter wasn't preparing for personal survival. He was preparing for community survival on a scale that would have impressed military logisticians. The third phase was construction. Using skills developed through 3 decades of military engineering, Peter began transforming the underground spaces he'd mapped into something unprecedented. A fully functional survival, complex capable of supporting hundreds of people for months. He started with the central hub, a large stormwater collection chamber that connected to multiple tunnel systems. Peter reinforced the walls, installed drainage systems to prevent flooding, and built partitioned spaces for different functions. Medical bay, communications center, food storage, weapons cache, command and control center. Next came the satellite locations, smaller spaces connected to the main hub through tunnels that Peter gradually expanded and improved. Sleeping areas that could house families, workshops for maintaining equipment, even a small hydroponic garden where fresh food could be grown without sunlight. The engineering challenges were immense, but Peter had solved bigger problems with fewer resources in places where failure meant death. He ran electrical lines by tapping into the city's power grid through junction boxes that nobody monitored. He installed water lines by connecting to mains that fed the buildings above. He built ventilation systems that moved fresh air through spaces that had been stagnant for decades. Most importantly, he built redundancy into everything. Multiple power sources, multiple water sources, multiple access routes. If any part of the system failed, the rest would continue functioning. If any access point was compromised, there were always alternatives. The work took 4 years to complete, and during that time, Peter maintained his cover as Tunnel Pete, the crazy homeless guy who disappeared underground and emerged smelling like sewers. He cultivated the persona deliberately, allowing people to believe whatever they needed to believe to avoid scrutiny. The few times city workers or police officers encountered him in the tunnels, they saw exactly what they expected to see: a mentally ill veteran who'd found shelter in spaces where nobody else wanted to go. They filed reports that were promptly forgotten, issued warnings that Peter ignored, and eventually gave up trying to keep track of someone who clearly wasn't hurting anyone except possibly himself. What they didn't realize was that Peter had built something unprecedented beneath their feet. A fully functional underground city capable of supporting 200 people for 6 months, complete with renewable food production, medical facilities, and communication systems that could coordinate rescue operations across the entire metropolitan area. Peter hoped he would never need to use it, but on March 15, 2024, at 3:47 a.m., the Cascadia subduction zone finally released the energy it had been building for over 300 years. The earthquake that hit Portland measured 9.1 on the Richter scale, the largest seismic event in North American recorded history. The shaking lasted for nearly 4 minutes, followed by a series of aftershocks that continued for hours. When the ground finally stopped moving, the city above had been transformed into something unrecognizable. Buildings had collapsed, bridges had fallen, and every major highway leading in or out of the city was impassable. The power grid had failed completely, water mains had ruptured throughout the metropolitan area, and communication systems were down citywide. Emergency services were overwhelmed within the first hour, and by dawn it was clear that help from outside the area wouldn't arrive for days, or possibly weeks. Above ground, chaos reigned. Thousands of people were trapped in collapsed buildings. Thousands more were injured and unable to reach hospitals that were themselves damaged beyond operation. Fires burned unchecked because there was no water pressure to fight them. Looters moved through darkened stores while police struggled to maintain any semblance of order. But beneath the surface, in a network of tunnels that had remained structurally sound through an earthquake that had leveled much of the city above, Peter Rodriguez was implementing a disaster response plan that he'd been refining for 5 years. The first phase was reconnaissance. Peter emerged from the underground complex at dawn, moving through the devastated city with the systematic precision of a military scout. He assessed damage, identified critical needs, and most importantly, began locating survivors who were trapped or injured beyond their ability to help themselves. The shopping cart that had once carried garbages now carried emergency medical supplies, communication equipment, and tools for extracting people from collapsed structures. The crazy homeless guy moved through the destruction with purpose and efficiency that would have impressed professional rescue workers, if any had been available. Peter's first rescue was Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman trapped in her apartment building when the upper floors had collapsed onto the lower levels. He found her 12 hours after the quake, dehydrated and suffering from a broken leg, but alive. Using techniques learned from urban warfare in Iraq, Peter cleared enough debris to reach her, provided first aid to stabilize her condition, and carried her back to the underground complex. Mrs. Chen became the first resident of what Peter would later call New Portland, the underground city that nobody knew existed until they needed it to exist. The second rescue was more complex. A family of 5 trapped in a collapsed grocery store. The father had been killed by falling debris, but the mother and 3 children were alive in a small pocket of space that was slowly filling with gas from a ruptured line. Peter spent 6 hours carefully removing debris without triggering a secondary collapse, then evacuated the family through storm drains that brought them directly to safety. By the end of the first day, Peter had rescued 17 people and brought them to the underground complex. By the end of the first week, that number had grown to 63. Word was spreading through the devastated city about a place where there was clean water, medical care, hot food, and safety from the chaos above. But Peter's operation was more sophisticated than simple rescue and shelter. Drawing on decades of military logistics experience, he had organized the underground community with the efficiency of a forward operating base. Medical care was provided by Dr. Sarah Martinez, a trauma surgeon who had been trapped in her clinic when the earthquake hit. Peter had rescued her on day 2, and she had immediately recognized the sophistication of the medical bay he'd constructed. Working with supplies that Peter had stockpiled and equipment salvaged from damaged hospitals, Dr. Martinez was able to provide surgical care that was better than what was available at most of the city's emergency shelters. Food distribution was managed by Tony Ritchie, a restaurant owner whose business had been destroyed, but whose knowledge of food service logistics was invaluable in feeding a growing population. The hydroponic gardens that Peter had built were producing fresh vegetables, supplemented by MREs, and canned goods that had been stored throughout the tunnel system. Security was handled by a team of volunteers that included 2 retired police officers, a former Marine, and 3 neighborhood watch coordinators. The underground complex had multiple access points, but they were all defensible and could be sealed if necessary. Unlike the emergency shelters above ground, which were struggling with crime and violence, New Portland was safe. Most importantly, communication was maintained through a ham radio network that Peter had built into the tunnel system. While most of the city was cut off from the outside world, New Portland was in constant contact with emergency services, military units, and relief organizations. Peter was coordinating rescue operations across a 50-square-mile area, directing resources to where they were most needed and providing real-time intelligence about conditions throughout the disaster zone. The underground complex that society's worthless homeless veteran had built in secret was functioning better than most official emergency response centers. But Peter's greatest challenge wasn't logistical. It was psychological. The people he was saving, the community he was protecting, had spent years walking past him on the street without seeing him. They had dropped spare change into his cup out of pity while considering him a burden on society. Now they were dependent on him for their survival, and the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming for many of them. How is this possible? Dr. Martinez asked on the 3rd day as she toured the medical facilities that Peter had built. How did you know this would happen? How did you prepare for all of this? Peter was checking the water filtration system, ensuring that the hundreds of gallons being processed daily met the standards he'd learned to maintain in Afghanistan. I didn't know the earthquake would happen, he replied quietly. But I knew something would happen. Cities are more fragile than people think. Infrastructure fails. Supply chains break. And when they do, people die unless someone has prepared for it. But the engineering, the construction, the planning, this is incredible. You built a functioning city underground. Peter nodded toward the main living area, where families were sharing meals, children were playing games, and elderly residents were telling stories to pass the time. I built a community. The infrastructure was just the foundation. Doctor. Martinez studied him for a moment. Who are you, really? I mean, before you were homeless. Master Sergeant Peter Rodriguez, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. 30 years of active service, retired in 2019. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why live on the streets when you had these skills? Peter was quiet for a long moment, watching the community he'd created and protected. Because nobody wanted to hear what I had to say when I was wearing civilian clothes and living in an apartment. They said I was paranoid, that I was living in the past, that I needed to move on from military thinking. But military thinking is disaster thinking. It's preparing for worst-case scenarios and hoping you never need the preparations. He gestured toward the tunnel complex around them. So I stopped trying to convince people to prepare. I just prepared for them. By the end of the 2nd week, New Portland housed 127 people. By the end of the 3rd week, that number had grown to 189. Peter's underground city had become the largest and most successful emergency shelter in the disaster zones, and its existence was spreading beyond the immediate area. FEMA representatives arrived on day 18, led by Colonel Janet Morrison, a logistics specialist who had worked with Peter during deployments in Iraq. She recognized his name immediately when she saw the incident reports that mentioned Peter Rodriguez as the coordinator for underground rescue operations. Sergeant Rodriguez, she called out when Peter emerged from a storm drain entrance to meet the federal team. Is that really you? Peter straightened slightly, muscle memory bringing him to attention. despite his civilian clothes and underground environment. "Colonel Morrison, good to see you again, ma'am." "Peter, what the hell is going on down there? Our reports say you're running some kind of underground shelter that's outperforming every official emergency response center in the region." "Yes, ma'am." "Would you like a tour?" What Colonel Morrison saw during her inspection of New Portland would later be included in federal disaster response protocols. As an example of ideal emergency preparedness, the tunnel complex was clean, organized, and efficiently run. Medical care was better than at most official shelters. Food distribution was systematic and fair. Security was maintained without oppression. Communication systems were functioning when most of the city was still cut off from outside contact. Most importantly, morale was high. The people living in New Portland weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They had formed a community, complete with shared responsibilities, democratic decision-making, and mutual support systems that were actually stronger than what many of them had experienced in their above-ground lives. "How many people can this place support?" Colonel Morrison asked as they stood in the central hub. "Current capacity is about 200, but I could expand that to 400 if necessary. Water and food production are scalable, and there's additional space that could be converted to living areas. Power, multiple sources. Solar panels hidden on rooftops feed battery systems. We're tapped into the city grid at points that weren't damaged, and I have backup generators with enough fuel for 6 months. Medical, full trauma capability, thanks to Dr. Martinez and supplies I've been stockpiling. We've performed 3 major surgeries and treated over 300 people since the earthquake." Colonel Morrison shook her head in amazement. "Peter, this is incredible. Why aren't you working for FEMA? Why aren't you in charge of emergency preparedness for the entire region?" Peter looked around at the community he'd built, the people he'd saved, the families who were safe because he'd spent 5 years preparing for a disaster that most people hoped would never come. "Because when I tried to tell people this was necessary, they said I was crazy. When I applied for jobs in emergency management, they said I was overqualified and probably suffering from PTSD. When I suggested that cities needed to prepare for infrastructure failure, they said I was being paranoid." He paused, watching children play in a space that had been designed to keep them safe when the world above fell apart. "So I became invisible. I became the homeless veteran that people expected me to be. And while they were ignoring me, I built this. The official recognition came later. The congressional hearing, the medal ceremonies, the job offers from every emergency management agency in the country. Peter accepted some of the recognition gracefully, declined most of the job offers politely, and continued living in the underground complex he'd built. Because New Portland hadn't been created as a temporary disaster shelter. It had been created as a permanent reminder that society's most vulnerable members often have the most to offer, that the people society writes off as worthless may be the ones who save it when everything falls apart. In the months that followed the earthquake, as the city above was rebuilt and life returned to normal, many of the residents of New Portland chose to stay. They had found something underground that they'd never had on the surface. A community that valued preparation over consumption, mutual aid over individual success, and practical skills over social status. Peter continued his work, but now with official support and recognition. The tunnel complex was expanded and improved, becoming a model for urban disaster preparedness that was studied by emergency management professionals worldwide. The crazy homeless guy became Professor Rodriguez, teaching courses in disaster preparedness and community resilience at universities across the country. But on quiet evenings, when the tunnels were peaceful and the community was safe, Peter would walk through the spaces he'd built and remember the 5 years when he'd been invisible. The years when society had written him off as worthless while he was preparing to save their lives. Because Peter Rodriguez had learned something that most people never understand. Sometimes the greatest service you can perform is the one that nobody sees coming. The preparation that nobody thinks is necessary until it becomes the difference between survival and catastrophe, Above ground, the city had returned to normal. People hurried past homeless veterans without seeing them, made assumptions about worth based on appearance, and went about their lives assuming that someone else was responsible for preparing for the worst. But beneath their feet, in tunnels they'd never seen, a community continued to thrive. A community built by a man they'd once considered worthless, maintained by people they'd once ignored, and ready to save them again the next time their perfect world fell apart. Because Master Sergeant Peter Rodriguez understood something that civilian society had forgotten. The mission never ends. It just changes form, and sometimes the most important mission is the one that nobody asks you to perform. The one you perform anyway, in silence and secrecy, because lives depend on it, and someone has to be ready. Some heroes wear uniforms and get medals. Others push shopping carts and sleep under bridges while building the infrastructure that will save thousands of lives. Peter Rodriguez had been both kinds of hero, and he'd learned that the second kind might be more important than the first. So now I ask you, have you ever walked past someone society considers worthless? Have you ever made assumptions about value based on appearance? Share your thoughts in the comments, because heroes don't always look the way we expect them to look. Sometimes they look like failures, like burdens, like people who have nothing to offer. Until the day we need them to save us. Thank you for watching Retired Soldier Stories. If this tale of hidden preparation and underground heroism moved you, subscribe and help us honor those who serve in ways we never see. Until next time, remember that the person you ignore on the street might be the one preparing to save your life. And sometimes, that preparation happens in places you never knew existed, built by hands you never thought were capable, funded by sacrifice you never recognized, and motivated by service you never acknowledged. The underground empire was real. The homeless veteran who built it was real. And the next time disaster strikes, there might be someone you've overlooked who's ready to save you. Look closer. Judge less. Because heroes hide in the most unlikely places.